Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of Mortica Presents FREDtime Stories. On this show, I will be reading short horror stories from both up-and-coming authors and horror legends. In case you didn't know, I am your host, Dead Fred. I am also the voice of the horror-inspired rock band Mortica. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and leaving a like and a comment. If you want to know more about Mortica, please follow us all on our social media accounts. If you'd like to support the show and the band, join our Patreon page. For just $5 a month, you could have access to behind the screams footage, early access to merchandise and music, as well as a monthly live stream from yours truly. Now, without further ado, let's get into tonight's reading. Tonight's reading comes from an unusual source. The same author who brought us Big Friendly Giants, and even friendlier top-hatted chocolatiers. From Roald Dahl, The Landlady. Billy Weaver had traveled down from London on the slow afternoon train with a change at Reading on the way, and by the time he got to Bath, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear, starry sky over the houses opposite of the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile along the other side." Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid town. "Find your own lodgings," he said, "and then go along and report at the branch manager as soon as you get yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was one of the common characteristics of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at the head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to the front door, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork, on the doors and windows of the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by the street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught light of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains of some kind of velvet material were hanging down. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a fire burning right in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with his nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, as far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and the big sofa and several plump armchairs. In one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in places like this, Billy told himself, and all in all it looked to him as though it could be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evening and plenty of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper too. He had stayed a couple nights at a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, and To be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name conjured up images of watery cabbages, rapacious landladies, and powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go. And now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window, and then all at once his eye was caught and held the most beautiful, peculiar notice that said, "Bed and breakfast." It said, "Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast." Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from the house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once because he didn't even have time to take his finger from the bell, the door swung open and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring a bell and have at least half a minute's wait before the door opens, but this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 to 50 years old. The moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please, come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after her into the house was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round, pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come in out of the cold?" "How much do you charge?" 5 and 6 pence a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had thought he'd be willing to pay. "If that is too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 pence less without an egg." 5 and 6 pence is fine," he answered. "I should like very much to stay here." "I know you would. Please come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one of his best school friends welcoming her into the house to stay for Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang it there," she said, "and let me help you with your coat." There were no other coats or hats in the hall. No umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it isn't very often that I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest." The old girl is a slight bit dotty, Billy told himself, but at 5 and 6 pence a night, who gives a damn about that? "I should have thought it would be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am. Of course I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teensy-weensy bit particular, if you can see what I mean." "Ah, yes." "But I'm always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And as is such a pleasure, my boy, such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and see someone standing there. Someone exactly right." She was halfway up the stairs, and then she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head, smiling down at him with pale lips. "Someone like you," she added, and her blue eyes traveled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body, to his feet, and back up again. On the second floor landing, she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up another flight. "This one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I do hope you like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching the lights on as she went. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?" "No," he said, it's Weaver." "Mr. Weaver. How nice. I've put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle and strange beds with clean sheets, wouldn't you agree? And you may light the gas fire any time if you feel chilly." "Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you very much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed and that the bedclothes had been neatly tucked back under one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried." "That's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?" "I'm not a bit hungry, thank you. I think I'll just have to go to bed as soon as possible. I have to get up very early to report to the office." "Very well. I'll leave you to unpack. Before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to, because that is the law of the land, and we don't want to be breaking any laws at this stage of the proceedings, do we?" She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that this landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't bother Billy in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, but there was no question about that, but she also was quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war and had never quite gotten over it. A few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little Dachshund was sleeping soundly in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. "I'm a lucky fellow," he thought, rubbing his hands. "This is a bit of all right." He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. "That's funny," he thought. "It's Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Where on earth have I heard that rather unusual name before? Was it a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps? Or a friend of his father's? No, that wasn't it." He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road in Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive in Bristol. "Gregory Temple," he said aloud, searching his memory. "Christopher Mulholland. Such charming boys," a voice said behind him. As he turned and saw the landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of risky reins on a frisky horse. "They sound somehow familiar," he said. "They do? How queer. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that odd? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that?" "Famous?" she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. "Oh no, I don't think they were famous, but they were incredibly handsome. Both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall, young, and handsome, my dear. Just exactly like you." Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. "Look here," he said, noticing the dates. "The last entry is over 2 years old." "It is?" "Yes, indeed, and Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years ago." "Dear me," she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. "I never would have thought it. How does time fly, Mr. Wilkins?" Weaver, Billy said. Weaver. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me. I do owe an apology. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something, Billy said. Something that's really quite extraordinary about all this? No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, both of those names, Mulholland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or another, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were famous for some kind of thing, you know, like Dempsey and Tunnel and Churchill and Roosevelt. How amusing, she said. But come over here now and sit down beside me on the sofa. I'll make you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean for you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them, Billy said. I'll think of it in a second, I'm sure I will. There is nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this just lingering on the outside of the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now, wait a minute, he said. Just wait a minute. Mulholland, Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that name of the Eton schoolboy who had been on a walking tour of the West Country and then all of a sudden milk? She said. And sugar? Yes, please. And then all of a sudden Eton schoolboy, she said. Oh, no, my dear, that can't possibly be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea's all ready for you. She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and then she sat there smiling at Billy, waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down at the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. There we are, she said. How nice and cozy as this is, isn't it? Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke, but Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him. She could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him of... Well, he wasn't sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? Or something like the corridors of a hospital. At length she said, Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea. Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea. I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about those two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines. Left, she said, arching her brows. But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is here also. They're on the 4th floor, both of them together. Billy set his cup down slowly on the table and stared at the landlady. She smiled back at him. She put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. How old are you, my dear? She asked. 17. 17, she cried. Oh, what a perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17. But I think he was a trifle shorter than you. In fact, I'm sure he was. And his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that? They're not as good as they look, Billy said. They've simply got masses of fillings in the back. Mr. Temple, of course, was a little bit older, she said, ignoring his remark. He was actually 28, and yet I could have never guessed if he hadn't told me. Never in my whole life. There was not a blemish on the boy. A what? His skin was just like a baby's. There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again gently in the saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another one of her silences. He sat there, staring straight ahead. out in front of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. "The parrot," he said at last. "You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window. I could have sworn it was alive. Alas, no longer." "It's most terribly clever the way it's been done," he said. "It doesn't look the least bit dead. Who did it?" "I did." "You did?" "Of course," she said. "Have you met my little Basil as well?" She nodded towards the Dachshund curled up comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time just been as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently at the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish, black, and dry, perfectly preserved. "Good gracious me," he said. "How absolutely fascinating." He turned away from the dog and stared with a deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be awfully difficult to do something like that. "Not in the least," she said. "I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass. Will you have another cup of tea?" "No, thank you," Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. "You did sign the book, didn't you?" "Oh, yes." "That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that most every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple," Billy said. "Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked at him, and out of the corners of her eyes gave him another gentle little smile. "No, my dear. Only you." I hope you've enjoyed tonight's reading, and hope you will stop by again. My name has been Dead Fred. Until next time, stay scared.